that is famous as a place of holy sea. Noise is always loud, there are sirens all around and the streets of me. If I can make it here, I can make it anywhere, that's what they say. See my face in lights, on my name a monkey's found down on Broadway.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Ben Max, the executive editor of Gotham Gazette, a publication of Citizens Union Foundation. Very happy to be moderating another of these excellent civic conversations hosted by Citizens Union and Citizens Union Foundation. We'll get to our conversation about mayoral transitions and how a mayor starts governing in just one moment. I want to introduce Disability Rights New York, providing closed captioning, and we hope momentarily American Sign Language interpretation for this event. We're just getting our signer online soon, we hope. You can access closed caption through Zoom subtitles by selecting the three dots at the bottom right of your Zoom window and select Show Subtitles. You can also access captioning on Stream Text, and we will drop that link into the chat for you now. We hope momentarily Donna Jean from Disability Rights New York will be providing the ASL as she has in prior civic conversations, and she'll be spotlighted for the program if we can get her online here. Disability Rights New York helps to make sure that everyone, including people with disabilities, are part of the conversation. Disability Rights New York helps people with disabilities who face barriers because of their disability, including voting. We thank Disability Rights New York for providing this valuable service for this civic conversation and others. We'll get to our program with our great guests in just one moment. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce, for brief opening remarks, Betsy Gotbaum, the Executive Director of Citizens Union and Citizens Union Foundation.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. Very pleased to have two distinguished speakers, Carl Weisbrod and Richard Buery. Neither one of them can be topped with what they know and the experience they've had in city government. I know Sheena Wright was supposed to be on. She had told me she could and would and wanted to, but then the day before yesterday, she couldn't do it. So I apologize for that, but I'm sure Carl and Richard can take up the slack very, very easily. So thank you for joining, and appreciate your interest and support of Citizens Union. Thank you. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, Betsy, and thank you for the work you're doing, of course, at Citizens Union, Citizens Union Foundation. Gotham Gazette is the publication of Citizens Union Foundation, the biggest program of Citizens Union Foundation. So if you are a reader, a subscriber to Gotham Gazette, please do support us through Citizens Union Foundation. For those who are not readers or subscribers to Gotham Gazette and are here, please join us at gothamgazette.com, and you can sign up for our morning newsletter, The Eye Opener, at the website. So glad everyone who's here is here with us today as part of Citizens Union and Citizens Union Foundation's mission on matters of civic importance. This is part of a series of civic conversations. We've held programs earlier this year. This will probably be the last one for 2021. We've held programs earlier this year on ranked choice voting, on COVID recovery in New York City, on police reform. We had a great discussion a little bit after the primaries about what just happened, with experts breaking that down. And now we're very happy to have one on mayoral transitions here today. So very excited for this conversation. Just a reminder to everyone watching here on Zoom, you can set your view to gallery view in order to see all the speakers at once. So set your view to gallery view if you want to be able to see everyone at once. All right, let's bring on our panelists here. Really excited about this conversation with a couple of experts and government officials who I've known for a while now, and remember meeting as the de Blasio administration was just getting going in late 2013 and into early 2014. So some interesting perspective will be shared with us here today. All right, so I'm happy to be joined by Richard Buery. Richard is now the Chief Executive Officer of Robin Hood, New York City's largest anti-poverty organization. From 2014 to 18, he served as Deputy Mayor for Strategic Policy Initiatives for the City of New York under Mayor Bill de Blasio. In that capacity, he implemented pre-K for all. He supported women and minority-owned businesses, and he oversaw a number of mayoral offices and other initiatives. Richard, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here.
And Carl Weisbrod. He's a senior advisor at HR&A Advisors, focused on complex public-private real estate development projects. Carl has served the city and state of New York in many capacities, including as chairman of the New York City Planning Commission, director of the New York City Department of City Planning, founding president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation, as well as a board member of the MTA and more. And Carl was a co-chair of Mayor Bill de Blasio's transition team back in 2013 into 14, and we'll find out if Carl was the lead on recruiting Richard to the administration. We're going to get into that and much more here with our guest. Carl, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Ben. Happy to be here and certainly happy to share this with Richard.
It's great to have you both. All right, so let's get into our discussion here. I just want to remind the audience not only to set your view to gallery view, but also if you have questions for the group here, myself and our two guests, you can type those questions into the chat feature of Zoom. And towards the end of our conversation, we're going to try to get to a few audience questions. So at any point, maybe you want to hear some of what they have to say first, but at any point you can throw your question into the chat and we will have someone monitoring those to try to pick out some ones towards the end that have not been addressed. All right, Carl, let's start with you. What has been your experience working on transition teams? Is it just the one I mentioned? Have you had others? And just broadly speaking, what is that like?
Well, the only transition that I really was a leader in was the 2013 Bill de Blasio transition, which, as you noted, I was the co-chair. I'll tell you what it was like. Within 6 hours of the announcement that I was going to be a co-chair of Bill's transition, I had over 1,200 emails in my inbox. And so that was a harbinger of things to come. And I certainly understand why Sheena Wright is extraordinarily busy these days, because a transition is exceptionally hectic. So in terms of the transition itself, that was the only one that I really had a major role in managing. But as someone who went through several mayoral transitions as someone in city government, I can attest that each one of them is unique, as I'm sure this one will be as well.
And we'll get more on your experience in a moment. Richard, your experience in transitions, whether mayoral or otherwise, I believe you're on a transition committee as we speak. What's your experience with transitions been like, and what it, broadly speaking, what's your experience been?
Yeah, so I think my reaction will be similar to Carl's, and I also served on the Bill de Blasio Transition Committee under Carl's leadership on the Education Committee. I'm currently serving on Brad Landry's Transition Committee, and not playing a formal role in the Adams Transition Committee, although certainly several of my colleagues are involved in that work and have personally tried to be helpful informally. But I think that's right. There's just a lot to do, both in terms of the development of policy and the development of people. And I know one of the things that when I was on the Education Committee, I would say that the primary focus was more on people and policy. The focus of our committee was trying to generate talent to bring to the administration. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important, as Mayor-elect Adams has, and as Bill de Blasio had such a vast, broad array of people from different backgrounds, different contexts, different cultures involved in the transition, is precisely because you really do want to have that broad network to make sure that you're reaching into as much of the available talent pool as possible. So very busy, very exciting in my experience.
And for both of you, how focused is it on personnel? How focused is it on policy? How focused is it on the nitty gritty of ensuring communication between the outgoing and the incoming? Is there a way that you can sort of break down those priorities? Or of course, there's so many people involved that there's people doing different things.
I would say, there are three, fundamental goals of a transition, and however, while each one is unique, I think the goals are pretty much the same. One is to, of course, identify the key personnel that you want to bring into the new administration. A second is, and a very important second, is what you have to learn about the outgoing administration. Certainly for the de Blasio transition, there are two aspects of that. One, we were very blessed with very detailed transition memos from the Bloomberg administration to the de Blasio administration. Those were enormously helpful. But in addition to that, we spent a lot of time interviewing in person outgoing administration commissioners and deputy mayors, because those more confidential conversations were much more candid, where commissioners and deputy mayors could not only talk about what their accomplishments were, but what immediate crises we were going to face when we took office, and what they saw as their failures and their obstacles. They were very helpful and candid about that, and that was extremely helpful. And then, of course, the third, and I'm sort of doing these in order, the third is creating a fundamental outline of what the program, what the immediate goals of the incoming administration should be. Because, as I think Richard particularly can attest, because he was responsible for implementing probably Mayor de Blasio's major #1 goal, that is pre-K. You have, as an incoming mayor, a honeymoon period that lasts for a very limited period of time. And if you don't get off the block very quickly and go after what you see as your #1 priorities, those #1 priorities will fade over time and not be realized. It's no surprise that virtually every mayor's first term is a lot more productive than their succeeding terms.
And Richard, how has your experience shown the challenges and the different lanes of what a transition needs to do? How are you thinking about this, participating now in the Lander transition as controller, being tangentially, as you said, involved in the Mayor-elect Adams transition, and from your past experience about priorities and what Carl just said?
Yeah, so first of all, I agree with all three priorities. Obviously, people understanding the last administration, learning what you can, including what's going to come up in front of you, which, is imperfect, because I think the crises that wound up taking over my first few months in the administration were not things that had been pre-planned necessarily. And the third, absolutely developing your immediate goals. I would add a fourth as well, which is related to all three, which is how do you organize your government, right? Because it's not like what deputy mayor roles you have, who reports to who, how do you set up the inner workings of City Hall? What are the mechanisms around communication and collaboration you want to create for your senior team? I think it's also an opportunity to try to think those things through in advance. That obviously directs who you hire, but of course, your ability to sort of win on your early goals also depends in part on having a structure that's going to allow you to be successful. And again, there's no single answer to that because it depends very much on everything from, who are the people, what is the leadership and management style of that mayor? Are you going to be somebody who wants to live in the weeds? Are you going to be somebody who wants to stay at the 50,000 foot level? That's going to vary by issue. How you want to get information, how do you want to collaborate. So I think that's also, for me, I think a very critical part of how
just to add to what Richard said, that is so true. I mean, the mayor's any mayor's most important commodity, most precious commodity is time. And it unique to each mayor is how so far it's only been how they want to spend their time. Do they want to be outside mayors? Do they want to be inside mayors? Do they want to focus on certain high priority projects? Do they want to focus on certain agencies? And from that, really, as Richard says, that's how the government should get organized to support the way the mayor wants to spend his time and what his priorities are. And that's unique to each mayor, which is one reason why, if you look at the city halls over the last several administrations, they've each been organized in very different ways to suit the priorities, personality, and desires, really, of that mayor.
Yeah. Can I follow up, Ben? I'm sort of curious.
I'm happy to back off and let you two just talk. Go ahead.
Well, no, it's funny. I haven't had a chance to talk to Carl for a while, so I'm excited to maybe be able to pick your brain. I learn so much every time I talk to you.
Vice versa.
One thing I'm curious about, because I've only worked in one city administration. I think that, again, what Carl and I are saying is so true, that organization, how the organization reflects that mayor. That also, of course, changes. I think in part because, the mayor of the city of New York is such a singular job. Even if you had broad management experience leading a complex enterprise, you probably didn't manage an enterprise as complex as City Hall. And so one of the things that was sort of very interesting to me during my own time at City Hall is how, not necessarily how the structure changed, but how our interactions changed, how we as a team collaborated, the meetings that the mayor wanted to have, how we worked changed just as he got to know what it meant to have that job and knew what he needed and didn't need. So I guess my question, Carl, I'm wondering, like in your experiences, how have we seen that change early? Like, by March, how different were things in January? By June, how different were they in March in that first year?
Well, I think the one that probably was in many ways the most dramatic change was Ed Koch, who started out with 7 or 8 deputy mayors, and after a year decided, at least for him, that really didn't work, and he reduced that to 3 deputy mayors, and for the remaining 11 years of his mayoralty, that pretty much was it. I will say, and I'm going to defer to Richard on this. I've always, in my many decades of being in city government, have always avoided City Hall. I've never wanted to be at City Hall. So to me, one of the lessons I learned from Nat Leventhal, who oversaw more transitions than all transition chairs combined. He oversaw the Dinkins transition. He oversaw the Giuliani transition. He oversaw the Bloomberg transition. But one of the things that Nat always used to say is that City Hall, and Richard can talk to this better than I can, City Hall is largely reactive. It is not particularly proactive. City Hall goes in wanting to be proactive for sure, and obviously each mayor wants to be proactive. But the challenges in the city are so great that, as Nat always used to say in the days when we had a morning and afternoon paper, that short-term planning was figuring out what the New York Post was saying that night, and long-term planning was figuring out what the Times was going to say the next morning. So I've always found running an agency a lot more entrepreneurial, and my bias is you got a lot done there because you can be proactive. But Richard can talk about the pressures of City Hall and and how it changes over time a lot better than I can. So Richard, you can really address
from
this
your
better.
experience, Richard, how much did things change from January to June of that first year, or from within that first year? And I guess I would add to that also, related to what we're talking about here are things that have been swirling around the questions for Eric Adams taking over, in terms of how many deputy mayors will you have? How will you sort of organize your time? Again, do you want to be very in the weeds, as you said, or do you want to be more at 50,000 feet? Do you want to be out in the city more, which he's pledged to do? But from your experience, how much did things change in that first half year? And do you have public advice here for the incoming mayor about organizing City Hall and some of those issues we've brought up?
Well, I mean, I think the answer in my one limit, my sample size of one, they did change a lot. I mean, I actually didn't join the administration until March. Right. So I was on the transition committee. I can't remember exactly when I agreed to take on the role, and so I was sort of in and out trying to juggle things leading up to March, but I wasn't really there until March. And I can say that things definitely changed. I think part of what changed is that sort of the daily. So we used to have an almost daily meeting of a range of senior City Hall officials, and over time, I think that having that meeting proved to be less productive, and because it was a large group, and I think the mayor, and again, I think this is a part of a mayor sort of understanding what do you need, wound up having a smaller group that met on a more regular basis. And that large group, the larger group, did not regularly come together, except on a project or a subject basis, as opposed to having a regular standing meeting. But again, I think that was partially a function of just Mayor de Blasio sort of just coming to understand like what he needs on a daily basis to be effective. I think what Carl said very much resonates. You really don't want to live to be reactive to the crisis of the day, especially because sometimes the crisis of the day didn't really feel like an actual crisis. But it's very hard not to operate that way. I just felt very lucky because in some ways my experience in City Hall felt very singular, because it felt in a lot of ways more like being an entrepreneurial agency head than it did feeling like I think probably what most deputy mayors' jobs feel like, at least when it came to the pre-K launch, which was very proactive entrepreneurial program development work. So that's about. So I guess just from my experience, what Carl said, similar. I mean, things change. Then Ben, I think your question was about what advice I would have for Mayor-elect Adams. Well, the one thing I will say about Eric Adams, and probably the thing I most admire about him, is that he is a truly curious person. And one of the things that he campaigned on is sort of like I forget how many conversations he said he had, but all the conversations he had with people who would work in and around city government leading into office. And he's continuing to have those conversations now. So again, I don't have public advice in the sense that this is how you should do things. There isn't an answer to that. Like there is no one answer. What I appreciate about him is that he is getting input from every administration, right? From Koch administration, Giuliani, Bloomberg, and de Blasio, and really using and asking really interesting questions to try to understand what are the different choices, what are the different pathways. And so that gives me confidence. I think the thing that you want in the mayor is somebody who recognizes that it's too big to think that you know how to do it before you get there. And someone who is willing to be open-minded and to be curious and to be humble about that journey. And it's one of the things that gives me so much confidence about Eric's leadership.
We've brought up your leadership on pre-K a couple of times here. I want to dig into that in just a few minutes, but we're going to come back to that and the responsibility of being charged with fulfilling the mayor's #1 campaign promise, and how, in a transition sense, building that project up, you obviously had a lot to work with coming in, but had to expand things to such a degree. Let's come back to that in just one second. Carl, on this question of structuring the government, number of deputy mayors, from your experience, do you think there's a right formula? Does it really depend so much on how Eric Adams is thinking about his top priorities and how he, the city he's inheriting and is going to lead for at least 4 years?
I don't think there's any single formula on how to do that. As I said, it really depends largely on how he wants to spend his time and what he wants to delegate and what he wants to personally oversee himself. So that will be a large part of, I think, how he decides this. It really is a very personal issue. I think, as Richard said, one of the things you learn, no matter how experienced you are in city government, and I've spent most of my working life either in it or around it, it is a vast enterprise. It is huge. And there are so many nooks and crannies to it that it really is hard, almost impossible, to get your arms around all of it. Maybe impossible to get your arms around all of it. So picking the right personnel is very, very important. And I just will spend a little bit of time in that, because it's not the job of the transition to appoint people to positions in the government. That's the mayor's job and those closest to the mayors. The role of the transition really is to try to bring a range of choices to the mayor and his key aides, so that he can, on the one hand, so that he can vet them and decide himself, and then do a preliminary vet of those people. So if a mayor wants to appoint somebody, he's not surprised 2 weeks later, before that person is formally vetted through the Department of Investigations, that there's some weird skeleton in the person's closet that nobody knew anything about. So those, I think, are two of the major roles of the transition staff, and then the third is how it is sequenced, because you really have to start appointing the deputy mayors, with a few exceptions, first, so those deputy mayors can be involved in the decisions regarding the commissioners who report to them. Again, those commissioner appointments are also mayoral appointments, but unless the deputy mayors and the commissioners that report to them, get along, you're going to have a dysfunctional government. And invariably, there are instances where they don't get along for one reason or another. But you really want to minimize that to the extent possible. And the exceptions, at least the exceptions that Bill de Blasio made before all the deputy mayors were in place, so deputy mayors in place were people who were reporting directly to him. The the police commissioner, the chancellor. Those were very important, high-level appointments that he personally wanted to feel very, very comfortable with. And then the deputy mayors sort of followed from that, and they became involved in the appointment, along with the transition, the appointment or vetting of commissioners. Ultimately, again, the mayor's appointment.
You mentioned a couple things. It stuck with me since he said it. I think it was at the very end of Mayor de Blasio's first year, and he had a press roundtable that I was at where he was reflecting on the first year and taking lots and lots of questions. And I think one of the things when he was obviously asked, you know, what have you learned and you know, what sort of surprised you, et cetera, growing into the job, one of the things he said was, you just can't quite be prepared for the volume of incoming, the amount that you have to deal with on a daily, weekly, monthly basis is just almost incomprehensible until you're in the job. And you both have gotten at that in one way or another, as well as what you brought up, Carl, which is very related, which is just the behemoth of city government. So I guess my question for both of you is, as we look towards a new mayor, how essential is this idea of realizing that you can't micromanage city government? You can't even really micromanage City Hall, or correct me if I'm wrong, especially you, Richard, as we've gotten at having been in City Hall, and the importance of the balance of delegating and being prepared to let your deputy mayors and your commissioners do what you've empowered them to do. What's that all about? What advice do you have for Eric Adams and others generally? And what's your experience taught you there? Why don't you start, Richard, in terms of that issue of the volume and what Carl brought up about the massive city government and how hard it is to really run?
Well, you know, Carl said a few moments ago that the most precious commodity that you have as mayor is time, and that's clearly the case. And therefore, I think one of the most important functions of people around the mayor is trying to understand what information does the mayor want, what information does the mayor need. And I think also maybe recognizing those two things are not always the same thing, right? And so really trying to help the mayor manage that. And so it's one of the reasons why you need to have a team that the mayor trusts in those critical positions. Is why the people in the mayor's sort of front office, or however you sort of manage who gets to sort of walk into the office when they want and who gets managed, why that's so important. I think it also speaks to why it's important not only who is in City Hall, but what personal support network the mayor has in place. Who are the friends? Because you also need people who aren't in City Hall, who aren't in government, but who are wise and smart, who can be a sounding board. So I just think that for me, it just sort of all comes down to being self-aware. As a mayor, you sort of have to understand how you work, what stresses you, and then you need people around you who understand that, who can sort of try to manage, help you manage your life, so that you are succeeding in what is a absurdly stressful and challenging role. And it's one of the reasons I will just say personally why I think, you know, I'm always so sympathetic. You know, being a deputy mayor is 1/1,000,000th. I mean, there is nothing comparable to that job. The distance, I mean, the office was nearby, but the job was 1,000,000 miles away. And so I think also as somebody in that office, you wind up feeling very loyal because you sort of see the personal and professional pressure that person is under. And you want to make sure that that you are not doing anything to hold them back from being successful.
Yeah, I just want to, you know, just to add to what Richard said, they're really, you know, on the hierarchical order, we have a president, we have governors, we have mayors. For the for residents of the city, the mayor does not have the august presence that a governor or a president has, whoever the mayor is. And many people feel, hundreds of people, thousands of people feel that they have a right to have a direct conversation with the mayor. And so the screens around the mayor are much more porous than the screens around the governor or a president. And that pressure on the mayor's time is extraordinary. And as someone who has spent a lot of time in Manhattan, particularly dealing with people who feel themselves captains of industry and masters of the universe, they all feel that, what do you mean? I should be able to call up the mayor and he should be responding to me in 5 minutes. And that kind of pressure is enormous on a mayor. I just want to say one other thing about the structure of City Hall from a different perspective, which is from the perspective of someone who's run several city agencies. From the perspective of someone running an agency, especially an agent, all agencies have to deal with many different issues beyond their own jurisdiction. Having clean lines of authority in City Hall is really, really important to the efficiency of the agency. If it's murky, who's to the agencies, who's responsible for what in City Hall, it creates a huge problem. And so it's not just how City Hall relates to each other, it's how City Hall relates to all the agencies, and having very clean lines of authority, however many deputy mayors, however City Hall is organized, is really crucial.
And just quickly, Carl, is from your experience, especially watching these last two mayors, is there anything that's kind of self-evident at this point about the management style that's required to be mayor of New York City? That, no, you're shaking your head, no, go ahead.
I think, look, when you look at the last, I go back to John Lindsay, and when you look at each mayor from John Lindsay, they each had a very different management style, and the way City Hall was organized reflected that style. I mean, you know, Mayor Bloomberg
they're all equally good, though.
They all are equally good to serve that particular mayor, and they all, you know, inevitably, none of them are perfect, but they all have to serve the person who's the elected official. I mean, after all, the person who is the mayor is the person who's been elected, not the deputy mayors, not the commissioners, and so it's the job of everyone to make the government work efficiently, but it's got to be structured in a way that allows the mayor to work efficiently.
Richard, let's talk about enacting Bill de Blasio's #1 campaign promise, this universal pre-K program, which now, as his 8-year tenure is wrapping up, is widely celebrated as his most important achievement, widely, even among his critics, given to him as credit for something big that he achieved. In terms of coming into government, as you said, you didn't even really get to start on day one, but coming in early on and being charged with this project, what was that transition period like? That was not the mayoral transition of December into January, but it's still part of this transition period. What was that like? What did you learn from it? And any big takeaways that Eric Adams will need to know about executing on his biggest promise or two?
Yeah. Well, Ben, I think something you said, you talked before about the pressure. I mean, Carl was talking about sort of that honeymoon period. Because the mayor had promised what seemed, even to me coming into the job, as a wildly far-fetched promise, right? Like we're going to go from about 20,000 full-day pre-K seats to about 50,000 within the first 9 months, right? So by September, or really because I started in March, within 6 months, and then go to full universality by the next fall. It felt a lot of pressure for the obvious reasons, the big promise, the big task to take on. Felt a lot of pressure because, as we said, it really felt like, and I think the mayor certainly felt this, is that the ability to deliver or not deliver on that promise would have implications beyond that promise, or would have implications for his entire agenda. Because the inability to do that would mean the loss of credibility. The ability to deliver that would mean the gaining of credibility for a poverty-fighting agenda and an anti-inequality agenda that was much broader than pre-K, that included housing and workforce protections and education and a broad range of investments. And I will say personally, I actually felt it even more deeply, because I sort of felt like the people's ability to believe in government and the easy ability that it comes off too flippantly in American political discourse to dismiss government as inefficient or as bloat or as waste or unable to get things done is a huge impediment to progressive policy that I think are critical to political equality and economic equality. So it's a lot of pressure. I think one of the things that I think Bill did, that Mayor de Blasio did, that was smart, is, and it goes back to, I think, the importance of transition and what you said, Carl, about getting clear on what your priorities were. Because he knew it was a priority, he treated it like a priority. Even the creation of my role, I mean, ultimately my role would change, particularly as pre-K launched, and I took on city agencies, and my job began to look more traditional like a deputy mayor. My initial job at City Hall, I didn't have an agency that reported to me. He didn't want me to. I had about 3 projects, of which the highest profile, well, actually 4 projects, of which the highest profile and the biggest was pre-K. He understood that implementing such a large project would require the coordination and the collaboration of the entire city government. And he wanted a deputy mayor who had the authority of that title, the proximity to him, but who could then work through other agencies and deputy mayors to get the work done. In a way, it's sort of contrary to sort of Carl's rule, which I think is a good rule normally, is to have clear lines of authority. In so many ways, my job just sort of upended all kinds of lines of authority. And that could be challenging at times. But I think ultimately, because people understood, including all the other deputy mayors and commissioners, that so much of their agenda was going to depend on that agenda, that people really stood up and collaborated, and we as a city got a very big and beautiful thing done.
Can I just note one other sort of unique thing at the time about the de Blasio transition, which was, that was the first time that a transition included citizen engagement, running separate and apart from the formal transition itself, but really parallel to it was what we called, not the transition itself, but what was called Talking Transitions, which was, as some of you remember, back in 2013, a huge tent in at the corner of Canal and Varick Street, where people could come in and talk about what they wanted from their city government. And as Richard said, the mayor as candidate really campaigned on fundamentally 2 issues which he hammered all the time: pre-K, stop and frisk, ending stop and frisk, implementing pre-K. But one of the things that came out of Talking Transition, including a major survey of New Yorkers, was how high on people's list of concerns affordable housing was. And that became, as a result of citizen engagement, really became a 3rd mayoral priority, leading to stop and frisk, leading to a major investment in affordable housing, leading to mandatory inclusionary housing, leading to a major investment in affordable housing, both of which I think will be hallmarks of the de Blasio administration, major accomplishments of the de Blasio administration. And I'm very, very pleased to see that, and I will say HRNA is involved in this, that the Adams transition is also working on a similar talking transition called NYC Speaks, to engage the public broadly as part of the transition and what the public wants. And I think that that is a major step forward that had never existed before. It's been copied in other cities around the country, in Harris County, Texas, in Miami very recently, Buffalo now. So I do think that's something that really was a major new development.
And what do you think is possible for this new endeavor, this NYC Speaks project? What do you think is possible to get onto the Adams team radar, or are there things just in your experience, your vantage point right now, or are there things you think are under the radar that might pop up here, or that's the part of all this, so we don't know yet?
Yeah, I think, well, look, I think we know what the issues are, the major issues that concern New Yorkers. Housing is a concern, crime is a concern, there are other, quality of life is a concern. Obviously, the pandemic is a big concern, but I wouldn't be surprised if this engagement reveals other issues that maybe none of us have really thought about as much. And part of citizen engagement is really the opportunity to hear broadly from the public, including major citywide surveys, to see what other issues, if any, the mayor-elect should take on as priorities.
Richard, speaking of priorities for the mayor-elect, you recently wrote an op-ed in the Daily News in your role as CEO of Robinhood about poverty, economic opportunity, the issues you're obviously focused on at Robinhood, but from your experience also in City Hall, do you want to take a minute to talk about that set of priorities? This is obviously something that the mayor-elect has spoken about, creating more opportunity more broadly, lifting people up, along with a variety of other things that he's spoken about, whether it's, reform at the police department and ensuring public safety, overhauling education, and some of the other priorities he has. But what are your key messages there for him and the public?
Sure, Ben, and I would encourage anyone who's interested. We issued a report called From Crisis to Opportunity, which really lays out our vision for an anti-poverty agenda for the next mayor, very much informed by both the experience of our grantees, our community partners who are out there on the front lines every day trying to advance equity through their work, as well as through something we do call the Poverty Tracker, which is a regular survey of New Yorkers who are living with poverty to understand, much in the same spirit of Talking Transition and NYC Speaks, to understand how do New Yorkers living in poverty or living close to poverty, how do they experience the city, and what do we want them to focus on? So encourage everybody to read that. And as I said in the Daily News, I mean, we really are trying to organize, we think ultimately it's organized around basic precepts, getting people back on their feet. So thinking about the material hardships that people face. So building a strong food infrastructure, continuing to invest in affordable housing, and really continuing to transition the system towards a kind of deep investments in truly affordable housing, rebuilding and reinvesting in NYCHA, the infrastructure of housing, which of course drives so much other work. So we think about getting people, getting families back on their feet. We think about getting kids back on track, which is really continuing to drive investments in educational equity. Mayor-elect Adams speaks so passionately about the ways in which the school system has continued to fail so many children, particularly Black and Latino children, for decades. And what would it take to revamp the educational system across the board, from early childhood to high school, investing in things like apprenticeship programs in high school, continuing to deepen the work of CUNY, which I think is probably, I want to overstate, but in my mind, in some way, the most important institution in the City University of New York, for the role that it plays in truly advancing educational opportunity for poor and working class New Yorkers. And we talk about getting New Yorkers back to work. So one of the things that Mayor Adams has been such a champion for, and that we also would support, is a deep investment in childcare, a truly universal childcare system. It's an anchor to getting people back employed, particularly for women who are 2.5 times more likely to cite lack of childcare as a barrier to getting to employment. But also making sure that the jobs we're getting people back for and we're training people for are good jobs. How do we make sure that employers, particularly employers and struggling businesses that are just hopefully emerging from the pandemic, investing and subsidizing those employers that they can bring people back to work even as they're emerging, making sure that jobs have job protections, making sure that jobs pay good wages and good benefits. So those are some of the big central parts of our agenda. And I do want to sort of reiterate what Carl said about NYC Speaks. And I think one of the other things I would say about the importance of community voice, that I think we've learned a lot from Talking Transition. We've learned a lot in the last 8 years, in part because of the work that have happened in other communities. And so now, and I think the way your firm, Carl, is thinking about this is so smart, is how do you create accountability so that as we get input from the community about what else is on that list, that it may not be in our mind, it may not be on anyone else's mind yet. How do you build accountability to ensure that the state of the city, the first budget, actually reflect and are accountable to those priorities? And ultimately, I think that's what gives people confidence in the new administration, is the sense that that transition is responsive to the city's demand and desires and hopes and fears. And I think it's why, Eric Adams has such an opportunity to be a transformative figure, because he is, I think, at heart, is someone who, I tell people all the time, I've had the opportunity to sort of walk down the streets of Brooklyn with Eric Adams. He is such a natural communicator. He is so good at it. I think he's very well positioned to make sure that we're sort of translating the people's priorities to the people's budget and the mayor's agenda.
We're in our last 5 minutes here, so I have a couple more questions for our great guests. And unfortunately, we're going to have to say goodbye soon, but this has been a great discussion. Carl, I want to ask you about your area of expertise, city planning, development, affordable housing, and sort of how a new mayor can kind of rethink some of that. What might be some of the important either big changes or tweaks that could be made to the many challenges that confront a mayor taking over, trying to plan in this city. But real quick before that, one mistake, one error from the de Blasio transition that you would say to the Adams transition, don't make the same mistake we did. Is there something that has stuck out to you for these 8 years that you want to get off your chest now, something that you would give them as a warning about proceeding here? Because we're having this conversation at the perfect time, right? They've been at work a few weeks, but they're really about to kick it into another gear when the mayor-elect gets back from Ghana. He's about to make a bunch of appointments, we think, and off they go. So what's one piece of advice you'd give that we haven't gotten to yet?
We were perfect. No, look, I think the major piece of advice is don't get pressured into making decisions. It's you really want to get off the ground as quickly as possible. But particularly when it comes to personnel, don't get pressured into making decisions early on that you'll live to regret. It is much, much more difficult to ease people out than it is to bring people in, and for all kinds of reasons. So you're never going to have 100% batting average, but you want to get as close to that as possible. And so you really do want your city hall team to be in place. You want to make a decision early on which commissioners, if any, in the outgoing administration are critical to keep for a while at least, or maybe permanently, but at least for a while, and so that there is not an interruption in service on key issues. I think those are the areas where mistakes get made, actually.
All right, and Carl, take a minute here. Just maybe the biggest thought you have, or maybe it's for a smaller tweak, but one or two things on the issue of city planning. There's so many challenges confronting the next.
Let me just say two things about city planning. One is that city planning gets a lot of attention, obviously, and there is a big issue that we've in effect been talking about. What is the proper balance between the needs, desires of communities and neighborhoods versus the goals of the city as a whole? That's one big area, and it's something that really has never really been solved adequately, but is always going to get attention. But the part that doesn't get as much attention, and where I'm most proud of what city planning does, is on macro planning. How do you plan for the city as a whole? And there are divisions of city planning, the population division, which really delivered for the census, a great census result in 2020. One of my biggest beliefs is that there has to be a much greater integration of planning and the capital budget with OMB and the allocation of resources. We think about planning as too much as just zoning, whereas the real planning is where and in what neighborhoods and for what purposes we're allocating our capital budget. And that really requires, in my view, a closer integration between city planning and OMB. And the two things I'm most proud of my time at city planning was A, creating a capital budget division, and B, creating a regional planning division, recognizing how we can build off what's happening in the region and how we can help the rest of the region because we are fundamentally integrated with it. Our lives did not stop at the shores of the Hudson River.
Right. All right. Well, we've opened up avenues for a lot more conversation, but we're going to have to stop it there. Really appreciate both of you joining us this morning. Richard Buery is the Chief Executive Officer of Robin Hood, New York City's largest anti-poverty organization, former Deputy Mayor of the City of New York, as we've discussed here. Carl Weisbrod is a Senior Advisor at HR&A Advisors and has vast city government experience, as we've spoken about here today. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course, to Citizens Union and Citizens Union Foundation for hosting this event. Thank you to all of you who've been on this Zoom. This was very well attended and we appreciate it. This was a great discussion. Thanks to our wonderful, experienced expert guests. Please find us at gothamgazette.com. We've been reporting on a lot of issues that were raised today, including CUNY and workforce development and the mayoral transition and much more. So check us out there. And please do support Citizens Union and Citizens Union Foundation so we can bring you programs like this and Gotham Gazette and more. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Paul.
See you, Richard.